Today on the John Ankerberg Show, where did we come from? How did we get here? What brought us into existence? In most high schools and colleges, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is presented as an established fact of science rather than a theory. But today, many leading scientists in their peer-reviewed literature are rejecting Darwin's theory for many reasons. One of the most important being the Cambrian explosion of animals, where complex, fully formed animals suddenly just appeared in the fossil record, with no prior ancestors before them. Why do some scientists believe that these animals present compelling evidence of an all-powerful designing intelligence in the history of life? My guest today is Dr. Stephen Meyer, who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University, as the author of the best-selling book, Darwin's Doubt. We invite you to join us. Welcome to our program. I'm John Ankerberg. Thanks for joining me. Our topic is, why are many scientists today rejecting the standard textbook theory of evolution, known as neo-Darwinism, that we all learn in high school and college textbooks? And where do the problems with contemporary evolutionary theory begin? Well, in the next several weeks, we're going to take a fresh look at the theory of evolution and the scientific problems confronting it with scientist and philosopher Dr. Stephen Meyer. Dr. Meyer is a former geophysicist who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University. And he's written two best-selling books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. In Darwin's Doubt, Dr. Meyer tells how Darwin himself doubted the ability of his own theory to explain a crucial piece of evidence, and how that doubt has grown up to create a major crisis in evolutionary thinking today. Darwin was troubled by a major event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, in which the first major groups of animals appeared abruptly in the fossil record. Dr. Meyer, we're glad that you're here. And today I want to begin with a clip from Illustra Media's beautiful documentary movie, Darwin's Dilemma, which describes the turmoil scientists experienced when they discovered that the earliest animals in the fossil record appeared abruptly without any evidence of prior ancestors. I want you to watch.
The Burgess Shale was once part of a massive reef in the Pacific Ocean, a haven for a menagerie of life that thrived at the edge of what is now the North American continent. Throughout long periods of geologic upheaval, tectonic forces elevated these rocks and the fossils they bear more than 7,000 feet above sea level. Here, the basic body plans of major animal groups that still exist today, and many others now extinct, made their first appearance in the fossil record so suddenly that biologist Richard Dawkins noted, "It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history." These fossils gave science its first detailed look at the biology of the Cambrian seas. With computer animation, we can now bring that world to life. First described in 1899 from a fossil found on Mount Stephen, Guiwaxia has also puzzled scientists. This mysterious Cambrian animal is covered with overlapping scales and may have fed by scraping microscopic particles off the seafloor. The animal most frequently discovered at Walcott's Quarry was Marella. More than 15,000 fossil specimens of this prehistoric crab have been excavated, most revealing multiple pairs of jointed legs and feather-like gill branches used for swimming. The anatomy of Hallucigenia has baffled paleontologists since Walcott first discovered its fossilized remains. 2 rows of sharp spines on its back and more than a dozen needle-thin legs gave the animal the appearance of being upside down, even when it was right side up. At the top of the food chain was Anomalocaris, the undisputed terror of the Cambrian seas. Measuring up to 3 feet long, this super predator used barbed feeding arms to capture both hard and soft-bodied animals. It then devoured its prey with layers of razor-sharp teeth. Between 1910 and 1924, Charles Walcott collected more than 60,000 Cambrian fossils, many of which are still studied in museums and research centers around the world. But the treasures of the Burgess Shale represent more than a wealth of information about ancient life. They are also flashpoints in a controversy that began long before the great geologist ever set foot in the Canadian Rockies.
You know, Dr. Meyer, just looking at that video clip, the animals that were found there, those fossil remains, were really well-developed animals, complex animals. Why did these fossils pose such a challenge to the accepted evolutionary theory about how life originated on Earth?
Well, there were two reasons that the discovery of these Cambrian animals created a doubt for Darwin about the adequacy of his own theory, and he acknowledged this in The Origin of Species. The first reason had to do with Darwin's picture of the history of life, the way he depicted life's history. We all remember from our biology textbooks, he represented the history of life as a great branching tree, and the animal tree of life would have had at the top of the tree the first complex forms of animal life, and those forms would have arisen, according to Darwin's thinking, as a result of a series of slow, gradual transformations from some common ancestral form way back in the Precambrian times. But instead of the branching tree picture of the history of life being documented in the fossil record, what we actually see in the fossil record of the emergence of complex animals, is that most of the first complex animal forms of animal life, the major groups of animals, appear very abruptly in the fossil record without any discernible connection to simpler ancestral forms in the lower Precambrian strata. And so you have this contrast between the Darwinian picture of the history of life, which I show in this slide on the bottom, and the actual pattern in the fossil record. And you can see there's a very great contrast between the theory that Darwin put forward of the history of life and the actual evidence in the fossil record. So you have a challenge from the evidence of the theory. The second problem that Darwin recognized, and which also troubled him, was that the Cambrian explosion posed a challenge to his idea about how these animals had been built. He had proposed that the mechanism of natural selection acting on small incremental variations would have acted very gradually and slowly over a long period of time to produce the complex forms of life. But instead, what we see in the fossil record again is the abrupt appearance of these forms of life with no evidence that they arose as a result of a slow, gradually acting process. And so the Cambrian fossil record not only challenged his picture of the history of life, but it also challenged his ideas about the mechanism by which complex living forms would have arisen.
Yeah. All right, folks. Now, in this next clip, I want to show you what Charles Darwin himself wrote in his book on the origin of species, what he predicted paleontologists should find in the fossil record if his theory of evolution was correct. I want you to watch.
In 1859, this country estate, 30 miles south of London, was ground zero for a scientific revolution. Here, in the solitude of his study, Charles Darwin completed his landmark book on the origin of species. In it, Darwin attempted to explain how every organism that had ever lived evolved from a single common ancestor as a result of natural selection acting on random variations.
The idea of evolution itself, change over time, was not novel with Darwin. What Darwin did that was, I think, really revolutionary was to advance a hypothesis of common ancestry, that all living things were related.
He would have a branching tree pattern And for a long time, you would only have that one species, and then it would eventually branch into 2 species, and then more species, and different families and orders and classes. And in Darwin's thinking, given enough time, those differences accumulate, especially under natural selection, if the environment changes. Those differences accumulate to the point where 1,000 or 1,000,000 generations from now, your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be a different species.
So it is both logically and almost aesthetically a unifying picture, a unifying image that pulls together the whole of life on Earth. And for many biologists, that kind of unification is very important.
Common descent and natural selection became the twin pillars of modern biology, and Darwin's branching tree of life its foremost icon. Yet despite the clarity and detail of his argument, Darwin acknowledged a problem that defied explanation: the Cambrian fossil record.
The distinctness of specific forms and their not being blended together by innumerable transitional links is a very obvious difficulty. I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks.
When Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, it was well known at the time that the first fossils of animals appeared suddenly without precursors in the geological record. So there was a deep conflict between what his theory told him to expect to find, namely an abundance of transitional forms going back to that common ancestor for the animals, versus what was there in the fossil record.
Darwin knew that if his theory was true, the older rock strata directly beneath the Cambrian layer should reveal a progression of fossils connecting simple earlier forms to complex animals like trilobites through a trail of incremental steps and failed biological experiments. Such evidence would document the trial and error process of natural selection.
But Darwin says in The Origin, where are these transitional forms? They're not there in the fossil record. What we see instead are fully formed, discrete groups. Now that's a world-class puzzle for someone like Darwin.
And so it's very, very striking, and one can see why Charles Darwin was so puzzled by the Cambrian explosion, because he had enough knowledge even at that time to realize that deep in the Earth history, you just didn't find the animals.
If my theory be true, it is indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, and during these periods of time, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question of why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earlier periods prior to the Cambrian, I can give no satisfactory answer.
All right, Dr. Meyer, Charles Darwin was a brilliant man. When he was faced with this evidence, how did he try and solve this problem?
Well, he had a charming analogy that he developed that in which he likened the history of life, in particular the fossil record, to a book with many chapters in it. And he said, if we can think of the fossil record as a series of layers where the layers represent just different chapters in the history of life, we may have a situation where we have some chapters that have been lost, and where we maybe only have a page in one chapter, or where there's a complete chapter missing. And so he essentially tried to explain the absence of the ancestral fossils of these Cambrian animals, which he expected on his theory to be there. He explained away the absence of these fossils as a result of the imperfection in the fossil record, that either we hadn't found these fossils yet because we hadn't looked hard enough, or perhaps some layers, for whatever reason, were not preserved. They were eroded away. And so he tried to explain it away that way and analogized it to a book where some of the chapters of the book had been torn out.
Yeah. Well, we've got to acknowledge that in spite of this evidence, the fossil evidence, Darwin did not give up on his theory of evolution. And what he proposed, we want to look at next. So here's our next clip I want you folks to watch.
Darwin was deeply troubled by the Cambrian explosion. He called it an inexplicable mystery. But he wasn't about to abandon his theory, and instead proposed that the animals just looked like they appeared suddenly because he thought that the fossil record was incomplete.
I look at the natural geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone, relating only to 2 or 3 countries. Of this volume, only here and there a short chapter has been preserved, and of each page, only here and there a few lines.
So Darwin argued, well, perhaps paleontological discovery, digging through the rocks, needed more time, that the transitions were out there, that not enough collecting had occurred, not enough sampling, if you will, of the fossil record on Earth, and given time, those transitions would turn up.
All right, Stephen, if Darwin was waiting for new fossil discoveries to solve the mystery of the missing ancestor fossils, what have the new discoveries in paleontology shown us?
Well, that's the really remarkable thing, and that's what's so significant about the Burgess Shale, the great discovery that was made in Western Canada in the early part of the 20th century. New fossils have turned up, but rather than ameliorating or eliminating the mystery of the Cambrian explosion, they've actually made the mystery more acute, because what the new fossil finds have shown, both in the Burgess Shale and also other fossil finds, in particular one in China, what these new finds have shown is that there were many more Cambrian animals, complex animals, that arose in the Cambrian period than even Darwin knew. And so the explosion was, if you will, more explosive than he understood. And for each of these new forms of Cambrian animal life that arose, each of these were in turn lacking discernible ancestors in the lower strata. So whereas before you had a pattern with a group of complex animals arising, each of which was lacking ancestors in the lower strata, now you have an even wider array of new complex animal forms arising abruptly, again, with each of those new forms missing ancestors. So you're looking at an even more explosive pattern as a result of these new discoveries.
Yeah, and even as you said in your book, okay, Darwin's Doubt, you said even a child can look and see that these animals that just appeared are different, they're more complex, or they're very complex. They're really something to look at.
Well, it might be helpful for your audience to get a sense of just how dramatic this event is in the history of life, because there are about 36 phyla, and a phylum is the largest division of animal classification. So there are about 36 phyla in the history of life. About 26 or 27 of those phyla are fossilized, and of those that are fossilized, fully 20 of the phyla first appear in the Cambrian. There are representatives of those phyla that first appear in the Cambrian period. So this is a big event in the history of life. A lot of the new form and structure, the new body plans that have existed on planet Earth first arrived during that period of time, and they do so very abruptly without clear connections to ancestral forms in the lower strata.
That's why they call it a Cambrian explosion. It's boom, it's there. Folks, I want you to watch this next clip because new fossil discoveries have been uncovered. Let's learn a little bit more about the Burgess Shale site. Watch this.
3 decades after Darwin's death, Charles Walcott's historic work in the Canadian Rockies did nothing to fill the gaps in the tree of life or the fossil record. Walcott uncovered the remains of Cambrian animals unknown to Darwin, and each demanded its own unique progression of evolutionary ancestors, a trail of evidence that did not exist in the Burgess Shale.
Walcott realized that the Cambrian explosion of life was an even bigger problem than Darwin imagined. So, in an attempt to defend evolution, he reached back to Darwin's explanation of an incomplete fossil record.
Like Darwin, Walcott thought that the Cambrian explosion was an illusion. He was convinced that the fossils were there. They were just inaccessible to scientific discovery, and he expected that they would eventually be found someplace buried deep beneath the oceans.
For decades, Walcott's hypothesis was widely accepted, but untestable. However, later in the 20th century, new technologies led to empirical conclusions.
Once the oil companies started to drill offshore, they brought up what are called drill cores, and inside the core were hunks of sedimentary rock, and some of those rocks contained fossils, but none of them were made by animals that lived before the Cambrian explosion.
Since the 1960s, scientists have also used radioactive minerals and evidence of changes in the Earth's magnetic field to analyze and date undersea sediments. From extensive surveys, they have created this digital map that defines the age of the seafloor.
We now know that the oldest rocks on the bottom of the seafloor only date back to the Jurassic period, which means that on the standard geologic time scale, they're hundreds of millions of years younger than the rocks below the Cambrian strata.
If you are looking for the ancestors to the Cambrian groups, the last place you would expect to find them is out somewhere on the seafloor. Those rocks are much too young.
So how did the Cambrian animals emerge, and where are the signs of their evolutionary past? Darwin and Walcott both confronted and failed to solve this mystery.
Now, Stephen, if the Burgess Shale didn't solve the problems that Darwin and Walcott confronted, did any subsequent discoveries do that?
There have been some subsequent and very dramatic new fossil finds dating from the Cambrian period and from Precambrian rocks as well. But unfortunately, from a Darwinian point of view, these discoveries also have made the mystery of the Cambrian explosion and the mystery of the missing fossils even more acute. There has been a major find in southern China. The first discovery started coming out in the mid-'80s, and these were just exquisitely preserved fossils. And oddly, the fossils that were discovered in southern China were even more exquisitely preserved, even more beautifully preserved, with almost a photographic realism in the fossil impressions. The other thing that came to light because of this Chinese find was that, again, there were even more new complex animal forms alive at that time than we knew of from either the Burgess Shale or from the earlier fossils in whales of which Darwin knew. So with each progressive discovery in paleontology, our awareness of the degree to which this explosive event was explosive has just increased.
Why is it we're not hearing this in our schools?
Well, it's really hard to say, but most of the textbooks don't even mention the Cambrian explosion, and those few that do mention the Cambrian explosion don't mention that it is a major problem for Darwinian thought. And one of the things I do in the book Darwin's Doubt is I tell the story of the doubt that Darwin had, and I show how that doubt has grown up to become a major crisis in evolutionary theory, not only because it raises this mystery of the missing ancestral fossils, but also because it raises a deeper mystery about the evolutionary process itself. It's a mystery I call the mystery of how to build an animal. What process is there that could build these complex animals and do so in the very limited amount of geologic time that is available to the evolutionary process? It's actually a very big problem.
Yeah, I mean, folks, we are just getting started. Wait till you hear when Dr. Meyer starts talking about how animals are made, okay, and what scientists have discovered. Next week, we're going to show you that the plot only thickens as paleontologists continue to discover what the planet looked like before the trilobites and morillas first inhabited the seas. And folks, you won't want to miss this. I hope you'll join us then.
Stay tuned for scenes from next week's program. If you would like to have all of the information in our new series, The Mystery of the Missing Fossils, featuring Dr. Stephen Meyer, all 4 half-hour television programs are available on DVD for a gift of $49. You will see the astonishing evidence that has led scientists to conclude that fully developed, complex animals suddenly appeared on Earth during the Cambrian Age and had no prior ancestors, and why this fossil evidence goes directly against Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Why an all-powerful, intelligent designer is a better scientific explanation than Darwinism for the sudden appearance of fully formed animals in the fossil record. The 4 important programs in this series are available on DVD for a gift of $49. Then our second series is entitled The Case for Intelligent Design. Charles Darwin admitted he did not know how the first cell came into existence. But today, molecular biologists have discovered that the human cell is not simple, but complex beyond belief. In the nucleus of each cell is the DNA molecule, which contains a storehouse of 3 billion characters of precise information in digital code. This digital code is crucial to the origin and function of all plants, animals, and humans. But where did this complex DNA code come from? And is an all-powerful intelligent designer a better scientific explanation than Darwinism for the genetic information found in the DNA molecule? The 4 television programs in this series are also available on DVD for a gift of $49. And then third, we are making available the documentary movie Darwin's Dilemma, which will transport you by state-of-the-art computer animation back in time to one of the great mysteries in the history of life, the geologically sudden appearance of dozens of major complex animal types in the fossil record, without any trace of the gradual transition steps. You will learn of the vast intelligence God used in meticulously creating and designing the first animals. This documentary movie is available on DVD for a gift of $30. And finally, if you wish to order all 3 of these items together, that is both television series plus the documentary movie Darwin's Dilemma, they are available together in a special package for only $100. And to order now, you may call 1-800-805-3030. That's 1-800-805-3030. Or you may order these programs now at our website at jashow.org. Next week on The John Ankerberg Show,
there are many paleontologists now who are acknowledging that the Cambrian explosion is a real event and that it does pose a challenge to the textbook theory of evolution that we all learned called Neo-Darwinism.
to learn how to start a relationship with Jesus Christ, go to our website at jashow.org and click on Pray to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior.